Hi, this is Phil Carlton, and I got a question today about doing buttonholes in the hoop, and I thought it would make a good, quick little video. So I want to talk for just a couple of minutes about both laying out multiple buttonholes for stitching, and then also a little about placing them when you finish up. But the first thing I want to do is look at a couple of the different buttonholes that are built into our super designs. So I'm working in Premiere Plus 2 Embroidery, and I'm in the Extra module, and I'm going to come here to my Super Design tab, and set my category to buttonholes. And if I click the drop down here, I will notice there are, it looks like, 4 different categories of buttonholes, each with, I think, 9 in them. And I'm going to concentrate on buttonholes 2 today. I'm going to bring in 2 different buttonholes because I want you to notice something because it's pretty important. I'm going to bring in this buttonhole that has little decorative elements on the top and bottom. And I'm going to I'll bring in this one, I believe, that has just a buttonhole with an element to the side. And the main thing I want you to notice here is that if you look at the 2 different buttonholes, they're sized pretty differently. So you're going to need to think about how large you want the buttonholes to be for the buttons that you're going to use. Now, if you've ever done buttonholes in the machine, what I usually do is measure my button, and then I go to the machine and I add a couple of millimeters of ease to the height of the buttonhole so that I know that I can get that button through the buttonhole. And I'd want to do the same thing here. So I'm going to work with this buttonhole today. So I'm going to delete this one, and I'm going to go ahead and select this one, hit the delete button on my keyboard. Actually, no, I don't want to do that. I want to come in here and I want to measure this one first. So I'm going to go to my View tab and use my Get Length tool. And if I click and drag, I'm going to notice this buttonhole is about 23 millimeters tall, almost 24 millimeters tall. So it would probably be good for about a 21, 22 millimeter button. I'm going to right click to deselect that tool. And what I would really do is I would measure my button, and then I would come in and adjust the height of this buttonhole. So let's say I'm doing a 20 millimeter button, and I know right now, if I look here, my grid is at 10 millimeters. So I want this buttonhole to be a little over 20 millimeters, so I'm going to hold down my control key on my keyboard. Now, when I resize this buttonhole, it's going to stay in proportion, and I'm going to take it down to just a little bit over 22 millimeters. What you're really going to want to do, though, is measure it and then come back here, and if I measured this now, I'm going to see this is right about 22, so that's going to work well for a 20 millimeter button. I'm going to right click to deselect that tool. And the other thing I'm going to do for this example is I'm going to get rid of this little flower just because I just want us to concentrate today on the buttonhole itself. So I'm going to go to my Modify tab. Now notice right now I have those green handles that you've probably heard me talk about before. And once we go to Modify, where we're going to be editing the design at the stitch level, it's going to fix it as stitches. While it's green, I can resize it and make it larger or smaller, and it will recalculate or redigitize it. Once we go to Modify, it's going to turn it into stitches, and you won't be able to do this anymore. So you always want to make sure that you finished sizing a design that comes from the software, whether it's lettering or a frame or a super design, before you go to the Modify tab where it's going to turn it into stitches. I'm going to go ahead and click OK to turn this into stitches. Scroll down so I can see it. I want to get rid of the yellow flower, and the easiest way to do this is to uncheck color number 2, which is the buttonhole. When I uncheck color number 2, it's going to hide those stitches so I can't select them. Now if I click Select All Visible and Delete, when I go back to my Home tab, all that's left is going to be my buttonhole. I'm going to go ahead and click Zoom to fit. Now, if we look at this picture, I measured it really quick just to kind of get a reference. It's one that we did previously with some buttonholes in the hoop. And you'll notice that the buttonholes run about 12 inches from one end to the other. So what I'm going to do is create a virtual hoop or a fake hoop for a second that is that size. It's going to make it real easy for me to spread out the buttonholes. So I'm going to click on Change Hoop, make sure I have Enter Hoop Size checked, and for my width, I'm going to type in 12 and do the inch mark, the quote mark, and when I hit the Tab key on my keyboard, it's going to convert it to 305 millimeters. I know I'm going to have to use my 360 hoop to stitch this out, but that's going to get my width that I'm going to need for my buttonholes. Now to spread them out, I'm just going to use Encore. So if I go to the Encore tab, tell it I want to Encore these to a line. And I like, usually, you do your buttonholes in odd numbers. I'm going to do 5 for this example. So I'm going to set my repeats to 5 and click Preview. Now if I grab the little white handle on the right side, as I drag it to the right, it's going to space out these buttonholes nice and evenly all the way across my 12-inch area. So I'd probably come right around there somewhere. I know it's outside the hoop, but we'll change the hoop in just a second. Then I'm going to click the green check mark to apply, and now I have 5 perfectly aligned buttonholes that are sized for my project. I'm going to go ahead and go back over to the Home tab, click the Change Hoop, and I'm going to go ahead and type the size for my final hoop, which is a width of 360, and I would probably use my 200 hoop for this, and click OK. So now that we've created our buttonholes, the next step is going to be to plan to embroider them. And I want to show a few pictures to talk about the process. So the first thing that I would do is I'm going to hoop something like Inspira Aqua Magic Plus, which is a water-soluble sticky stabilizer. So I'm going to bring out my hoop, and I'm going to hoop this water-soluble sticky stabilizer. And then I'm going to stitch a running stitch right down the center of the hoop. That's going to give me a nice vertical placement line. Now, taking into account where that stitch is and also looking at the horizontal center of the hoop, I'm going to take my pillow back or my garment or whatever I'm going to do, and I'm going to place it to the right of that line and stick it down with the sticky stabilizer. Now, I'm assuming here that probably if you're sewing buttons, you've created a placket already or something with enough stability that you've got stability for that piece. So the water-soluble stabilizer here is just to hold it in place. Then after I've stuck the fabric in, then I come in and I stitch my buttonholes, and now I've got a finished piece with perfectly aligned buttonholes. So let's look at how to create that straight line. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my buttonholes, and I'm going to move them out of the way here for just a second. And I'm going to go over to my border tab, and I'm going to create a running stitch that's just running probably about 8 inches right here through the center of the hoop. So in my length, I'm going to type in, if you remember, about 25 millimeters to an inch. I could type in the 8-inch shortcut, but I'm just going to type in 200 millimeters. Then I'm going to click my Select Motif. Now, if you click Select Motif, I'd already been playing, so my stitch is already up. You're going to want to change to the stitch you need. And I'm going to use just the FOF standard running stitch, which is under FOF 1.1 and stitch number 1. And I'm just going to leave the stitch length at 2.5 millimeters. Remember, this is going to stitch out on water-soluble stabilizer, so it's not really that important. It's just giving us placement. And I'm going to click OK. Now, the other thing I want to make sure to do before I click the apply is if I click apply right now, because this group option is checked, it's going to bring in a row of these decorative stitches, or this 200 millimeter running stitch, and it's going to group it with this object right here. I'm going to click outside my hoop so nothing is selected. Now when I click apply, there you can see it's created that running stitch for me right there down the center of the hoop at about 2 inches long. Now the other thing I want you to think about is when we're stitching, and we bring things into Premier Embroidery, they're going to stitch out in the order that we bring them in. I want this to be the first thing that stitches, so I'm going to go to the Home tab, and I'm going to click Layout Order, Move to Back. Now I know, because that's in the far back, that running stitch is the first thing that's going to stitch. Now before I do my final alignment, I want to go ahead and change my hoop just so it's easier for you to see what I'm going to do. So I'm going to click on the Change Hoop button. I'm going to uncheck Inner Hoop Size and go ahead and select. I'm going to go to the FOF Creative icon, and I'm going to use my 360 by 200 hoop with a natural orientation. You would of course use whatever hoop you needed for your machine. And then I'm going to click the OK button. So I know these are kind of out of my hoop, and we'll fix them in just a second. The first thing I want to do is kind of just get this rotated so it's running up and down. And to make it a little bit easier for you to see, I'm going to go to the View tab, and I'm going to uncheck, or I'm going to click on the Show Grid button to hide this. Then I'm going to come back over to the Home tab, and if I click Rotate 45 2 times, I can now see that running stitch is running up and down. Now I'm going to select the buttons and rotate them 45. Now I know they're going to go roughly right here, but now let's talk about positioning them. Looking at this picture, I went and measured, and I know I want my buttonholes to be about 3/8 of an inch away from the finished edge of, in this case, my pillow, but of whatever you're doing the buttonholes for. And I could just kind of eyeball it, but it's going to be easier for us to go in and use the grid to make this adjustment. So I'm going to go back over to the View tab. I'm going to click on Show Grid to activate my grid again. And this time I want to set my grid size to kind of the space I want between my running stitch and my buttonholes. For my example, I said I wanted it to be at 3/8 of an inch, which is 0.375 inches. And when I click the Tab key, that changed it, well, oddly, to 10 millimeters, which is right probably about where I was. So now I'm going to select this, and then I'm just going to move the edge of the buttonhole. If I kind of go to the lower right-hand corner and drag this to the right, I'm just going to adjust this buttonhole until it's centered right here at the center and right on that grid. So now I know I've got right there. If I do my get length, come from here to about here, there's my 3/8. So I'm actually going to scoot that over just a little bit, just so my button, it's a little into my buttonhole. It's fine tuning at that point, and probably, honestly, that is not going to make any difference, but just because I was being picky. I'm going to click Zoom to Fit. I'm going to go to the Home tab. Now if we go to the Design Player, and watch what's going to happen. The first thing that's going to happen is it's going to stitch that running stitch. We would lay down that fabric to the right, and then it would stitch our buttonholes. The only other tip I want to tell you is if you're trying to select this line for some reason, the one in the center, it can be very hard to click on because it's just a vertical straight line. So if you need to alternate between your designs, you can always use the Next Design button to move between the different elements, or the Tab key on your keyboard to do the same thing. There you go, buttonholes in the hoop. I hope you enjoyed this and learned something today. Thank you very much.